And Desi and Derek, if you want to go ahead and share your screen with your slides, or if you want to start your talk at any time, go ahead. I'm going to start the timer.
Okay, thank you. I'm starting here. Okay, hello everybody. My name is Desi Kirilova, and I'm the Senior Curation Specialist for the Qualitative Data Repository. And I'm presenting this new work of ours here, the research team at QDR, together with my colleague, Derek Roby, who is a postdoctoral fellow for QDR. The topic of our work is trends in data availability statements of articles with qualitative data published in PLOS between 2015 and 2023. I will lay out briefly the background and the motivation for our research, and then Derek will talk about the specific methodology we adopted and some of our most interesting results, and then I will close it again with some general comments and kind of recommendations that we are coming up with on the basis of this analysis. Oh, 1 second. There we go. So the background is, and I'm sure this will be news to no one here probably on the call, on the webinar, that journal and publisher data-related policies, which have been becoming more common over the past decade, now more than a decade, those two levers or factors are seen as particularly strong enforcement mechanisms that drive research openness and sharing. They're some of the best kind of most promising tools that lead researchers to make steps towards greater data sharing and research transparency. They generally all have the same goal, but various comparative studies that have emerged more recently, comparing these journal and publisher policies, discover that the specific tone, language, the degree to which data sharing is expected versus recommended versus required, and so on, show that implementation differs across different entities. PLOS in particular has been seen as a pioneer because they enacted such a policy in March 2014, which is one of the earliest instances for a large publisher. Then others like Springer, Science, Elsevier, and so on have followed suit since then. And more recently, we're seeing much smaller titles and publications that are based with disciplinary associations also moving in that direction more. But for us, PLOS was of interest because of this longer standing history with a data availability statement requirement and data related policy. That's one reason. And then the other reason is our particular focus on qualitative articles. So many of the other publishers do not publish as many as would allow us for the kind of analysis that we wanted to do. So just again, briefly, a little more background, what is meant by a data availability statement, which is the kind of unit of analysis that we looked at. This is a brief text, let's call it text, could be from one sentence to a little paragraph that basically is expected to tell readers where they can find the research data that an article is based on, an empirical article is based on, under what conditions those data may be accessed, if the data are not shared or if they're not shared fully, what portion of the data may be shared, and what are the reasons and justifications why the data may not be shared. The data availability statement, specifically in the PLOS context, is expected to include links where applicable to the data directly. And ideally, the understanding is, or the ambition is that they should be shared in a way that's fair, and practical implementation of that is understood to be in a repository, although that's not the only way that's acceptable. So here, I've taken a little screenshot of the PLOS own guidelines to researchers, and deposition within data repository is the one that shows up as a first acceptable data sharing method and is strongly recommended. So as I said, there's been some literature already looking at the ways that data policies and data availability statements lead, do not lead, to what degree they lead to actually more widely shared data. This is not exactly what we did, although there's a portion of our analysis that Derek will get to that where we did some of that as well, but that wasn't the initial focus. And as I said, our unique contribution is in looking and focusing specifically on articles that report on qualitative or multi-method with this very strong qualitative component research that typically is seen as the kind of work that can be justifiably accepted from data sharing expectations. The assumption is that this is where such exceptions will be most widely used and are appropriate and justified, which in many cases they are, but that leads people to not necessarily pay attention to the implementation of data policies when qualitative data are concerned. Here, just to illustrate how that plays out in the PLOS data policy, the general text says very strongly, authors must make all data publicly available without restriction immediately upon publication of the article. But then further, there are specific guidelines for qualitative data that focus on the fact that in many cases, authors cannot share the full qualitative data. In these cases, they're advised to make excerpts of the transcripts available in some form. And then even further, if sharing even excerpts would violate the agreement to which the participants consented, authors should explain the restriction, and that basically would become the text of their data availability statement. So we were curious about how authors of qualitative data research articles handle these expectations and what they do in practice. So I will I'll continue sharing, but let Derek present our methodology and results.
Great. As we discussed, we chose PLOS because of their sort of strong statement regarding and policies and expectations regarding providing data availability, and they implemented that policy on March 1st of 2014. And so we wanted to allow, for articles that had some time to sort of incorporate that process. So we limited our data collection to articles published between January 1st, 2015 and August 25th, 2023. We used advanced search queries on the website to produce a subset of these articles, and we used the qualitative search query, which produced 3,051 total articles. From this set of 3,051 articles, we excluded any articles that were primarily or exclusively using quantitative or computational methodologies. We also identified duplicates, entries without data availability statements, and entries that were research protocols rather than articles. We eliminated these non-valid entries, and our final data set includes 2,331 articles. We also collected data to assess whether key features of a research article might influence the content of data availability statements, and whether data availability statements are correlated with article engagement. So we coded articles for the data type and methodology that they used, and we extracted the text of the funding description, the abstract, the authors, and the author's affiliations, as well as the publication date and the PLOS journal in which it was published. We also used research tools to collect citation counts for each article and the geographic location of the lead author's institution at the time of publication. We used an iterative process to develop a coding guide. So first, a research assistant inductively coded a random subsample of 100 articles to generate a provisional coding scheme. Then we had two researchers each separately code a new random subsample of 100 articles. And after doing so, we discussed how we went about the coding process and resolved any discrepancies so that we could come to a shared understanding of the coding parameters. We produced a systematic coding guide, and then we applied the coding guide systematically. Both researchers applied it to all 2,331 articles, and then we identified discrepancies and resolved those discrepancies. So it was a pretty thorough process. The first set of 4 codes focus on what authors say in their data availability statement. So these codes are not mutually exclusive. They include cannot share when the author states that the data cannot be shared, in the paper when the author indicates that the relevant data are in the paper or in supplementary materials, such as an appendix, on request if the author's indicated that the data can be requested through some means, and in a repository if the author indicated that the data are available in a repository. We're also interested in whether and to what extent the data for each article were accessible in the way that the authors described in the data availability statement. So we determined that sending a request to authors, ethnic boards, or original data sources was not really feasible. So we decided to focus on the 315 articles for which authors described depositing the data in a repository. So the 2 researchers used the information provided in the data availability statements to attempt to locate the data, and they coded the results of this inquiry using 5 codes, and I'll discuss those in a bit. So first, I'll focus on the first set of analyses that we did, which was basically just a simple descriptive statistics that identified the distribution of the various coding categories for the data availability statements. So here you can see that the data availability statement for approximately 50% of the articles stated that the relevant data are provided in the paper or in the supplementary files. Although this was common, we feel that this sort of practice or language is somewhat unrealistic. Authors most likely use these types of statements to refer to excerpts that they quote in the paper to substantiate their empirical claims, but excerpts are only part of a project's data, and those portions are selected through an analytic or interpretive process during the writing process. So we suspect that most researchers do not believe that these excerpts can be accurately referred to as the project's data set. The second most common code was on request, with approximately 45% of the articles indicating that the data could be requested through some means. In these data availability statements, authors often indicated that data could not be shared publicly, but that reasonable requests would be considered. We have also coded where these requests were directed to, and I'll discuss that in a bit. Slightly more than 1/3 of articles indicated that the project's data could not be shared, often citing the sensitivity of the data, potential harm to participants, and the fact that consent forms did not address the possibility of data sharing. Although it was rare for data availability statements to indicate that the data are shared in a repository, approximately 14% of the articles did so. And as we will see in a bit, many of the articles that suggested that they deposit on a repository actually deposited the full data, which is encouraging. On the next slide, we'll see some trends over time. So we're interested in whether the language of these data availability statements changed over time. We do see a small but noticeable increase in the proportion of articles that indicated that the data are available in a repository. In 2015, the figure was about 7%. In 2023, approximately 15%. So we see this as an encouraging sign, which might be related to institutional changes such as funding mandates and journal requirements, and cultural shifts in the discourse around open science practices. The other changes are pretty minor. So over the period from 2015 to 2023, we see a slight decrease in the proportion of articles saying that the data are available on request or that the data are available in the paper. So on the next page, on the next slide, we look into the on request codes, basically where are they sent to. The most common was IRB or ethics boards. Approximately 45% of the articles indicated that data requests should be directed to the IRB or ethics board of their institution. Approximately 33% of the articles indicated that the data request should be sent to the author's institution, and these typically provide an email address to which the request could be sent. Slightly less common than that was data requests being sent to the lead or corresponding author. Approximately 25% of the articles in our data set directed the data request to the author. And finally, the least common by far was about 6% of the articles indicated that the data request should be sent to the original source. So these requests were often found in articles for which the authors were analyzing secondary data that had been collected by another researcher or set of researchers. On the next slide, we look into variation by funding. So we extracted the text for the funding statements and used binary code to indicate whether the researcher was funded or not. We found that differences in funding status are associated with only minor differences in the primary coding categories for the data availability statements. While there's no real difference between the funded or unfunded projects for the available and repository category, we see that funded projects were more likely to state that the data are available upon request or cannot be shared, and just more likely, not much more likely. I just want to clarify that. On the next slide, we look into variation by data type, and here again, we see only sort of minor differences, and I'll highlight a couple that were statistically significant. So surveys are more likely to be available in a repository and less likely to be on request or unable to share, which indicates sort of like a greater data transparency for surveys. And interviews are the opposite. They're more likely to be listed as on request or cannot be shared, and less likely to be in a repository. On the next slide, I'm moving quickly. Apologies for that. Variation by methodology. So mixed methods, differences. We have 1 minute left, so I'll move quickly. So we see sort of differences here that align with the data types. Data types or data methodologies that incorporate more sort of mixed methods data or potentially more quantified data were more likely to be shared with fewer restrictions. We do want to highlight quickly if we can move to the next slide, whether or not these are actually made available. So of the 315 articles that indicated that the data were available in a repository, we found encouragingly that the majority actually do make the full data available. some small portion of them are not available. It's about 15%. Some only make the quantitative available, 17%. And some provide documentation only, which, although not ideal, is more data research transparency than not sharing anything. So we find that to be encouraging, and I'll turn it over to Desi for the last wrap up.
Okay. Well, I'm not going to summarize the findings because we just went over them. But I will get to our very quick recommendations. In the analysis that we did, we discovered various interesting things and kind of maybe even tension points between what the journal has allowed to be published as a data availability statement and what was the reality. And so we think more communication between journals and repositories, especially if they expect and want researchers to use them, is welcome, and we're pursuing some actual activities on that front. But also we recommend that journals and publishers either reviewing their existing data availability policies or starting anew to write one, to address in an explicit section how qualitative and multi-method data projects are expected to comply, because clearly there is a lot of uncertainty, is what we think, among researchers. But there's also good models that could be followed. And so I think a journal reviewing or revising its data policy could make that more explicit and kind of clearer for authors of such papers if they're regularly published in that outlet, obviously, as is the case with PLOS. And then
I'm gonna have to cut you off. I'm sorry. We've gone over a minute over time. So I'm gonna have to, maybe we can save this and come back to it.
Okay,
A couple
sure.
of questions about your conclusions, because I think it's super interesting. As someone who does qualitative research, I could listen to this longer, but as someone who is moderating this session, I will have to move us on. So let's queue up the next talk right away. We have a talk on building a data services program and increasing data skills resiliency with the CPE capstone program. So please go ahead and share your screen and can start your talk whenever you're ready.
Okay, are you able to see my screen?
Not yet.
Not yet. Okay. Okay, can you see it now?
No.
No.
Look like you're sharing.
Stacy, do you have access to the slides? Would you be able to share?
Yeah, give me just a moment.
Sure.
Sorry, guys. It worked fine when we were testing it.
I know.
Classic.
Yeah.
There we go.
How's this? Okay.
That looks good. So we see it as like maybe minimized a bit, but that's fine. I think you can just go ahead. We can see the slides.
Let me, I can make it as big as possible. There we go. Is that better?
Perfect. That's great. I'm going to start the timer. Go ahead.
Okay. Well, good afternoon, and thank you for hanging in there with us. I'm Marianne Stolbrocki. I am the research data librarian at Wayne State University, and I am here with my colleague Stacy, and I'll let her introduce herself.
Hi, I'm Stacy Winchester. I'm the research data librarian at the University of South Carolina.
Okay. Next slide.
Well,
Okay. I'm going to be talking about the DSC PE program, which I imagine you have heard about either because you've been a participant or there have been several of my cohort members that have presented the last few days. But what I really want to highlight in my talk is talking about the fact that it's a reskilling program for early to mid-career librarians, and I absolutely fall into that mid-career bucket. Next slide. So why participate? Well, about a year ago, I started a new data position at Wayne State University, which had no existing data services. I did have some experience in data from a previous institution, but I really didn't have the background to set up a whole program of services. And I really liked this program as a way to learn within a cohort, but especially looking forward to the capstone piece of this program.
And I am a data librarian with a few years under my belt now. Data librarian has been my full-time job since January of 2019. I built the program at my university, and so I know what it is to be new and be learning. So I was interested in giving back. In fact, this was my second year as a capstone mentor in this program. And I'm always interested in meeting new data librarians who I haven't had an opportunity to interact with yet, and growing my network within our little sub discipline.
Okay, next slide.
I am hitting it. There we go.
Okay, so I want to focus on my capstone project, working with Stacy. My capstone project was absolutely, I say slightly unorthodox, but I would say it was very unorthodox. Generally, these projects are something that the mentor host institution gives to the mentee. They complete it, and it's a benefit of the mentor institution. One of the ones that I was particularly interested in, one of my cohort participants looked at the care principles for an institution's repository. But in talking to Stacy, she had a couple of projects that I could have done. But as we talked, she said, you know, you really sound like you're where I was about 5 years ago. And in talking about that, we decided that what if my project was to actually build out my services? And so to do that, we had 3 parts, and that included a data needs survey, which Stacy had done twice at her institution, and I've just completed at my institution with something like a 37% return rate from our faculty receiving grants. To customize the DMP tool, which led me to realize that despite the fact that something like 60 to 65% of our grants here at Wayne State come from NIH, people were not using the DMP tool at all. And finally, to really redo and update the suite of data libguides that we had here. But I'll let Stacy talk about how I hope that piece benefited her in this.
Yeah, I certainly did benefit as well. I have a data management libguide, which is probably not surprising to any of you. And it's been around for a number of years, several years, and it could use a bit of refreshing. And I think I'm probably not the only one who finds it very difficult to refresh an existing libguide. So I was very lucky because Marianne went through my libguide and compared it to other data management libguides that are hanging out on the internet and made some really fantastic suggestions to improve my guide that I am implementing. So that's a big benefit for me. And Marianne and I feel strongly that the DSCPE capstone program builds resilience in data services at universities and in the data librarian community. And we recognize that those two concepts, like data services and then the community of librarians who deliver said services, are pretty closely related. Data librarians' work is often siloed. I've heard that a number of times just during the course of this conference. you know, a data librarian might be the only person doing such work at their institution. And even if there's more than one, there might just be a couple. So because of the sort of lone wolf nature of our jobs, and because, you know, sometimes mid-career librarians' hours, a portion of their hours might be appropriated to provide these services, but substantial investment in training to make them able to provide the services might not happen. New data librarians, no matter where they are in their career, might not have a good handle on what's already out there. And having a more seasoned colleague to work with as they build services can be really beneficial. Instead of reinventing the wheel, depending on how you work your capstone, the DSCPE program allows newer librarians to learn from what others have already done. And that's kind of what we did with ours. And like our keynote speaker said a couple of days ago, you know, we build strength through interdependence. The relationship, or at least the way we did it, the relationship can also provide a safe space to learn and to ask the kinds of questions that you might hesitate to ask in groups or to other people that you don't know quite as well. And like I said, you know, it also builds resiliency in the data librarian community. So librarians are already great at building communities. We're skilled networkers, and I'm sure that many formal and informal mentorship relationships already exist within data librarianship, but DSCPE does formalize it in a way that can work out really well. We're also used to reskilling and rolling with the punches when the landscape changes. We've all learned that a lot this year. One thing that we think might be beneficial is for there to be more opportunities to form formalized networks to help one another, like start or design or improve services. We think that's something that a lot of librarians might take advantage of, especially like mid-career librarians who probably went to library school before research data services really existed as a normal thing in university libraries.
Okay, I just have a few final thoughts. You know, in this, I received a lot of benefit, and I feel like I probably got more out of it than Stacy in this particular situation. And so, you know, maybe the DSCPE program is not always the best place for something like our particular capstone to be worked out. But it worked out really well for us. Stacy and I have written an article for Portal, which will come out in the next issue, describing our experience. And for me, I feel like my data services are probably, you know, 6 months to a year further along than they would have been without this kind of opportunity. And I wonder if there isn't room as librarians in our suite of professional development opportunities for a slightly different kind of partnership program, especially for, you know, those in our mid-career where we're probably entrenched and we need a helping hand to just get things done, to do a similar kind of experience. And we know that there are lots of people out there that are, you know, solo librarians, or they're doing data work, but they're also doing, you know, 5 other jobs. You know, not everyone is lucky to have like a whole data services department. But in that, Stacy and I would like to continue our work and extend this into looking at maybe how could this mentor-mentee relationship work in data communities, you know, outside of the good work that the DSCPE program is doing. And very last, I would like to note that the DSCPE is funded through a gift from Elsevier and the Countway Library of Medicine. And Stacy and I both want to extend much gratitude towards Elaine Martin and Rong Tang for their impact on DSCPE, but also the data community at large, and all that they've done to help the reskilling process. And with that, I believe we are within our time. And I thank you for your attention. And if you have any questions at all, please don't hesitate to put them in the Q&A. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much. Let's go straight into the next talk so that we have some time for the Q&A. So the next one is about climbing stairs. I think. Is that it? Is that right?
Well, that's our clever acronym, which everyone has to have a clever acronym. So let me see if I can.
I'm starting the timer. Go ahead.
Yeah, okay. My apologies. I'm going to be looking away from the camera because my slides are on my other monitor. In the interest of time, I just want to be sure that we're going forward. So, hi, I'm Jake Carlson. I'm the Associate University Librarian for Research Collections and Outreach at the University of Buffalo, and I'm joined today by Michaela Narlock, the Director of the Data Curation Network. And as our moderator said, we are here to discuss STAIRS, which is a summit for fostering resilient institutional data service communities, which will hopefully make sense as we go through the presentation. So we've been dealing with research data requirements for quite a long time now. And when we talk about research data sharing requirements, we tend to talk about two primary actors. We talk about the funding agency, the folks who are enacting the data sharing policies and defining the expectations for fulfilling those policies, and the researcher, the folks who are tasked with carrying out those data sharing policies, following through on the expectations in their work. But really, it's a lot more complicated than that, right? So first of all, grants are not awarded to the researcher, they're awarded to the institution. And so there's a responsibility and a commitment the institution makes. And with that responsibility comes an expectation for support and potentially for services. There's also, I think, the widespread knowledge that researchers haven't typically had to do this before. So they have questions about, well, how do I interpret the data sharing requirement of the funding agency that I'm working with? And more importantly, how do I incorporate that policy into operational practice in my research, right? How do I take something abstract and translate it into the work that I do? And libraries really have stepped up to help, to provide support and services to support the researchers' work in sharing the data. And we do that by taking library science, the things that we've done for decades, if not centuries, and translating that into the data context. So providing consultations for researchers, helping them to understand and to situate themselves in the requirements, putting on training and workshops to help researchers better understand and apply the expectations from the funding agency policies, going as far as to work with the data itself and to curate it, to prepare it for sharing and reuse by others, and potentially even going as far as to collaborate directly with researchers as partners, being named on the grant and working with the researchers with defined data management or sharing responsibilities. And we've also invested a lot of time and effort in developing technical infrastructure, the most obvious of which is institutional data repositories, right? So some of us have institutional repositories that will accept data as a type of material within those repositories. And still others of us have developed repositories that are focused explicitly on research data that are available to folks at our institutions to use to satisfy those requirements. And I want to talk a little bit about some work that Michaela and a research group that she was a part of have done about really the growth of that infrastructure and the importance of that infrastructure increasingly in providing the kind of support needed to share data. So this is a graph from her work about just the growth of data repositories, or institutional data repositories that just focus on data, looking at different ARL members. And you can see over the years that we're seeing more and more repositories from institutions that are just focused on data. And then perhaps, even more importantly, the number of data sets held within those repositories of ARL members has grown dramatically too. You can see sort of three timeframes here, 2017, 2020, and 2023. And just the rate of growth, particularly from 2020 to 2023, has really taken off. And even if you exclude sort of the top triangle there, which is just Harvard in and of itself, the number of data sets held in institutional repositories or institutional data repositories has really grown to the point where, again, I think we're becoming critical infrastructure in regards to providing support for researchers in making all of this happen. But it's getting more and more complicated, right? With that increase in the number of data sets that we hold and the demand for our services, I think we're at a point now where we need to sort of slow our thinking with regards to having library data services and to thinking more holistically about institutionally based data services with a strong library component. So as this becomes more and more a part of the norms of research and more researchers are falling under these requirements, we really need other units in the institution to partner with and connect with to provide the kind of specialized services that researchers need, right? We need IT to help support storage with active data management, and they certainly do. But perhaps more importantly, we need to work with IT to look at how do we transfer data out of where it's being actively developed and actively managed into parts where it can be curated and stored in repositories for sharing. We need to connect with Office of Research. The folks in sponsored programs, for example, they're the ones who can determine whether or not a researcher has complied with funding agency policy. That is not something that libraries could or should do. And in addition, offices like the IRB not only need to sort of look at the research project and to determine, does it follow federal guidelines for ethical research using human subjects, but how would a researcher need to, what steps or activities would a researcher need to do in order to ensure that that data can be shared? And can they provide some help or support with regards to that? And then looking at research centers and institutes, researchers may be a part of those centers. They may have particular resources or particular tools or particular workflows that could support research data. So connecting with them as well, really important, again, as we scale up or consider how do we meet the demand of research data services. And so I think a lot of us have really been working on how do we develop relationships across the institution to make connections with IT or with members of the Office of Research and other places. So developing those relationships is increasingly important. Having a shared understanding of what it is that we bring to the table and what in turn IT brings to the table and how we can work together and understand where each other are coming from. And then ideally, and this is a bit of a pipe dream at the moment, we would have not just a relationship, but a set of connected workflows that could survive the person who we have the relationship leaving the organization, right? So rather than, knowing, somebody at IT, having enough of a connection with IT that we don't have to worry about one particular person, but we've got an ongoing connected relationship that we can use to, again, support the work and the demand at scale. And then in addition to sort of thinking about how we build institutionally based data services, I think we also need to look at how are we connected across institutions, and particularly around our institutional data repositories. We are developing pretty similar services. Our repositories do a lot of the same kinds of things, but we tend to develop them in silos away from each other, and that can limit our utility in making a bigger impact. So I'm thinking particularly about the metadata that we develop as part of working with institutional repositories. We each have metadata, and we may be using common standards or having common fields, but how we implement them, how we use them, how we interpret them often are very different, and that makes things like interoperability and federated searching very, very difficult. So again, thinking about how do we connect across institutional boundaries as well as within institutions to support the needs for data services. So in the interest of time, I'm not going to go too deep into either the desirable characteristics document or the Nelson memo. They were both published in 2022. I think it's another indication of sort of ramping up and the need to think larger at scale here. With the desirable characteristics, when that came out, a bunch of us in the Data Curation Network got together and did a self-evaluation, trying to measure ourselves and our repositories against the desirable characteristics and how well we satisfy those characteristics in our own opinion. And when we got together, sort of debrief on this, we all felt that generally we were doing pretty well, right? We met the criteria at a very high level. But as we started to talk a bit more about this, we realized it was very difficult to really evaluate ourselves against very broad criteria. There were certain situations where like, well, okay, do we really meet that criteria in this situation and in that situation? So really, we're struggling a bit in how do we do this on the ground? How do we again take some abstract characteristics and translate that into our own operations and our own services? And so as a result of that, we came up with a virtual learning series to sort of further explore what it might mean to connect with those desirable characteristics and to demonstrate that as part of our services. We had 4 different sessions as a part of the virtual learning series. We wanted to learn more about what funding agencies were thinking about in terms of the desirable characteristics and how they were sort of reacting or adopting them themselves. We wanted to get sort of a current state of things in terms of data sharing services and readiness in academic institutions. So getting sort of a state of where things are right now. Session 3 was about making the case for institutional repository services, for institutional data repository services. So folks who felt the need that it really would be beneficial to have a repository of their own, what kinds of arguments or persuasions or advocacy were helpful for people who were getting started right at this point. And then finally in session 4, really looking at the technical platforms that we have in repositories to support data sharing. Where were they? What did they do? What did we need as a result of trying to provide these particular services? And we learned a lot. These were very well attended. We have over 100 attendees at each of the sessions. I believe the recordings are on the Data Curation Network website, so they were very helpful, but we recognized that they weren't enough. One of the things that we recognized is that just an hour-long learning session wasn't going to be enough to really dive into where we were and the kinds of things that we needed to discuss, and with the kind of depth that we really thought would be beneficial. And the other thing is that we had high attendance here, but it was mostly librarians, and we really needed to expand the conversation to include folks from IT, to include folks from the Office of Research, to include people from research centers and institutes. So really, we recognized that this was great, but it wasn't enough. We needed more. And that's when we came up with the idea for the Summit for Academic Institutional Readiness and Data Sharing, or STAIRS. And I'm going to turn this over to Michaela now to continue the presentation.
Yeah, thanks. So let's go ahead and go to the next slide. The goal of STAIRS was we had 3 overarching goals, and they're going to sound quite ambitious because they were. So first, we wanted to define the current landscape of institutionally based data services. So while we had started with repositories that kind of drove that desirable characteristics in the virtual learning series, we really wanted to expand it and look more holistically at what institutional data services looked like. On the next slide, you can see our 2 other goals were to identify current and emerging best practices, tools, and resources in data services, in part because we wanted to figure out not only how do we incorporate those into our local practices, how do we connect as a community to continue developing and refining those best practices, tools, and resources. And lastly, I don't think any of us are surprised to hear about the value of community. We wanted to take some time to really create that sense of connection and community across data service providers within an institution and across institutions. And so if you go to the next slide, one of the kind of things I love about STAIRS is we encouraged institutions to bring representatives from different units on their campus. So this was kind of the approximate breakdown of attendees, and you can see it is still quite heavily librarian and archivist centric. However, we were still very pleased that some quick math, about 1/3 of the attendees were not, and that was really helpful for us to have conversations and just have people ask questions that I think we sometimes take for granted as librarians. On the next slide, you can I'll talk a little bit about the structure of STAIRS. We had 4 broad areas of focus we covered in 2 days. They were 2 very full days. No, we did not solve all 4 of these broad areas of focus, but what we really did was kind of kickstart things. Let's open these conversations. Let's start by seeing where we are at each of our institutions and how we can kind of work across our organizations. I know I'm going so fast, but I want to talk about the next 2 slides in more detail, so I want to leave myself some time. One of the things we did was we encouraged institutions to fill out a pre-summit survey. It was a lengthy survey in which we took the realities of academic data sharing initiatives, data management activities, and we asked each institution to respond to which activity they are doing, how developed that service is, and who offers that service. And while we don't have time to go into all of the results, I wanted to give a quick overview of this is what it looked like for one phase of the research lifecycle, the long-term access. So in terms of how developed services are, we can see that many are in the partially or planned stage, whereas few are in the fully implemented. And on the next slide, pardon me, we asked who was involved for each of these activities, which was so fascinating, and we can't wait to tell you more about it at a later date. And this one, we can see that libraries and IT really dominate, but the Office of Research is really supporting researchers with their security in terms of data sharing and management. So on the next slide, we have some recommendations. I want to start with the caveat that these were written in October 2024, which was a very different time. I'm not going to go through these in great detail, but we noticed that we needed more connections with program officers, we needed more opportunities to learn from one another, and we needed to clearly define what the role of institutionally based data services, what's their role across funding agencies and across disciplines. On the final slide, for us, you can see we have a QR code and a DOI for our final report where you can read all of this in great detail. And I actually have physical copies of the report. If anybody's interested, shoot me a message, get these out of my living room. This was a great joy to write. And yes, 3 months ago was a very different time. So we've got time for the question and answers. And on the next slide, you can see our contact information. We have a short link, which is z.umn.edu/DCN-stairs. And that's where you can see all of our project outputs. And please don't be a stranger. We'd love to connect more. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much to all of our presenters. So I'm gonna need people to ask questions to justify me cutting everyone off at their time. Otherwise, I'm gonna look like a jerk. So super interesting. And yeah, I have a lot of questions I would like to ask. And I just saw a question about like, what point would you like to say that you got cut off with, which I see you, person who asked that question. But the funny meta thing is now I'm going to cut you off, question asker, because this session has to finish and we have to go to the next one. So I just want to say thank you to our presenters and audience for participating in this session. And we will see you at our next and final session, which is the RDAP business meeting and closing. It will be at a different Zoom link in Feedloop, unless Ashley like makes some gestures right now to indicate that I'm wrong, but I think that's the case. It's open to all RDAP members and RDAP Summit attendees, so you're totally encouraged to go. And again, thank you to our presenters and attendees. Thank you for the folks asking questions. I am very sorry I had to cut everyone off, but time is not real. I don't make the rules. That's how, that's how the cookie crumbles. Please feel free to reach out to folks if you have more questions and you want to follow up with them. I think, doing it through Feedloop or offline is totally fine. And with that, I'm going to cut everyone off so that we can go to the next thing.
We've got to get
Thanks,
over there.
everyone.
Bye, guys.